In order to switch between login and sign up, in the auth component, we need to manage the currently active mode. And therefore, you could, for example, add a property is login mode. But you can name this whatever you want. In the end, the idea here is that you store if the user is currently in login or in sign up mode, and you adjust the user interface, but also what you do when the form gets submitted dynamically based on that property. So initially, that could be true. And then I will add a method on switch mode, which we can call from our user interface to change that property. This allows us to dynamically change what's on the user interface upon an event triggered by the user by using that helper property, a pattern we used many times throughout the course already. So in here we can set is login mode to false, but that's actually not what I want to do. Instead, the idea here is that we change it to the opposite of what it was before. And for that, we can use a handy shortcut. We can change it to not this is login mode. Whilst this might look strange at first, this simply reverses the value. If this previously stored true, then not true will be false, and therefore we now store false. If this stored false, then not false will be true, and we now store true. That's the idea. Now we just have to connect on switch mode and this is login property in our template. Now I want to switch the mode when we click that button here at the bottom. So here, upon a click, we can call on switch mode. That's the idea, because that should be our trigger for switching the mode. But now, of course, we also need to adjust the user interface based on the mode we are in. The form inputs we show shouldn't change, let's say, but the button labels certainly should. Here, for example, we'll not always show sign up, but instead we can use string interpolation to show a dynamic text. We can check is login mode, which is the property we just added. And if that is true, we know we are in login mode. So this button, which is there to submit the form, should actually display login as a text. And don't forget the single quotes here to really output text in there, because you're in the string interpolation syntax. Hence, everything in there is interpreted as JavaScript code. The alternative, and this is a ternary expression here with the question mark, then the code we want to execute if this condition is true, and then a colon, and then the code we want to execute if that condition is not true. So if that is not true, then we are not in login mode, and therefore I want to output sign up, because if we're not in login mode, we are in sign up mode. A side note, by the way, as I just said, this button should submit the form, so we should change it to type submit. The other button here, which switches modes, should be changed to type button so that it doesn't submit that form here. Because if you don't set a type, clicking that button, which is inside of the form, will actually submit it, and therefore if Angular doesn't step in, it will send an unnecessary HTTP request into the void, and even if Angular steps in and prevents the submission, it will trigger the form submission in Angular nonetheless, and we certainly don't want to do that for this button, only for the first one. So now we have that first button changed. The second button here, this text of course also has to change based on the mode we're in. Because if we are in login mode, then we can switch to sign up mode. So in that case that we are in login mode, we want to say switch to sign up. If we're not in login mode, then we are in sign up mode, and then here we should say switch to login, because that is the mode we can switch to. If you now save this and have a look, if I click this button now, indeed, correctly our user interface changes. So this is working, and that's our first important step. The next important step is, of course, that we handle the form input here. Now, handling form input is something you already learned about throughout this course. And here I'll use the template-driven approach, but of course feel free to use the reactive one if you prefer that. Now we got two inputs. The first one, this email input, this one will get ngModel, of course. And besides ngModel, it then also needs a name. And the name can be email, but of course you can take any name you want. I also want to validate whatever the user enters here. So I will add required, because this must not be empty, and also the email validator. These are both built-in validation directives Angular ships with, which allow us to validate the input for being there, for being any input at all, and for being a valid email address. Now the password will also receive ngModel and a name, which could be password. Again, that name is up to you. And here, that should also be required. And I also want to have a minimum length here because we will use Firebase REST API for authenticating. And it turns out that this REST API indeed requests us to have at least 6 characters. So here we can add the min length validator and give this a value of 6 so that passwords shorter than 6 will not be accepted. Now I want to disable the button if the form is not valid, and therefore on this form element, we'll use that trick you already learned about in the forms section. We get access to that form object Angular creates automatically for us by creating a local reference, giving it any name you want, like auth form, but that name is up to you. And then you set this equal to ng form. And now this will give you access to the Angular form object. And we can now use the auth form reference here, for example, on this button, to disable it if not auth form valid. So if the auth form is not valid, then the submit button will be disabled. And indeed now you see it is disabled. And if I enter an email address here, it still is disabled. If I start typing a password, it is disabled. And only as soon as I have 6 characters, it gets enabled. And if I convert this to something which is not a valid email address, it also gets disabled. So this works. We got working validation. Now, of course, when we submit the form, we also want to do something. So here on the form element, as you already learned it in the form section, we can add ng submit, and there we can trigger the onSubmit method and forward our auth form or just the auth form value, whatever you want. I will submit the entire form. Now, in the auth component, we therefore can add onSubmit here, and we'll get our form object here, which is of type ng form as an argument, and therefore you need to import ng form from @AngularForms. And now here we can, of course, for example, console log the form value and also call form reset to reset it once we're done. So let's give this a try. Let's go back here. Let me enter an email address and a password. And you see the form was reset correctly. It was disabled again. This button was disabled again. And you also see this is the data I got. This is the data I entered. This is now the data we'll use to actually use Firebase to, for a start, create a new user, and then to also, of course, log users in. I'm back in my Firebase project, and as with the normal HTTP requests, I really want to emphasize that you, of course, don't need Firebase to add authentication to an Angular application. You can add it with any backend, be that a REST or a GraphQL API. Your backend just needs to offer endpoints you can use to create new users and to log users in to get such a token, therefore. If your API supports that, and most APIs do, and if you're creating your own API, you can, of course, add your own auth logic, then you can use that API. You don't need Firebase. I'm just using it because it's easy, free to use, doesn't require us to write server-side code. That's the only reason. And with that, let's go to the authentication page here. And there, we now have to set up a sign-in method. Well, actually, before we do that, let's go to the database again. And there, let's go to rules. And under rules, previously, we unlocked this by setting read and write access to true for everyone. And this means that everyone can read our recipes, get our recipes, and store recipes. Everyone can interact with our database here. Now, this was required in the past because we had no authentication in place. Since this is about to change now, it's about to change these settings. And therefore, you should now change this to auth unequal null here for both read and write. This will tell Firebase that only authenticated users should be able to read and write data. Now, of course, if you were using Firebase for your project, you can set up more sophisticated rules for different resources, and the official Firebase docs are then the way to go. Here, I want to lock down everything, my entire Firebase database, if users are not authenticated. Publish these rules to make sure they have an effect. And what you will already notice now with this change is that if you go to recipes and you fetch data, you get an error here, a 401 error that you're not authorized. Now, of course, we could handle that error in a better way by displaying a nice error message here or anything like that. but we won't even reach that page soon because we will lock down access to it in our front end to provide a good user experience and avoid that a user is able to visit a page where he's not going to be able to do anything anyways. So for now, we can go there and we can fail, but soon this will change. But now we need to go back to Firebase and enable authentication so that we can slowly add the logic to be able to visit our authenticated routes again. So here under authentication on Firebase, click on Setup Sign-in Method and choose email and password and click enable here, only that top one. Now click save, and now you got that built-in Firebase authentication active, where you can send requests to certain endpoints offered by Firebase to create users and to log users in. And you'll then see your users here under authentication in the users tab. Now, which endpoints are that though? Let's start with signing users up.